France isn't poor, it's worse. Effort stopped turning into progress. You land in France expecting a finished product. The cafes are full, the streets are clean, the trains arrive on time. From the outside, everything looks fine. And that's exactly why this story is dangerous. Because what's breaking in France isn't loud. There's no crash, no dramatic collapse, no moment where the headlines scream crisis. Instead, something quieter is happening. People are working just as hard as before, but going nowhere. They're earning more on paper, but affording less in real life. Careers don't fail, they stall. And when millions of people hit the same invisible ceiling at the same time, an economy doesn't explode, it freezes. This video isn't about baguettes, vacations, or luxury brands. It's about why a country that looks wealthy is quietly getting poor. Why the middle class is shrinking, why ambition is leaking out, and why the math underneath France's lifestyle no longer adds up. France doesn't feel poor. That's the trap. On the surface, everything signals stability. Public life works. Paychecks still arrive. Services mostly function. The streets stay calm. To an outsider, this looks like a country that already solved the hard problems. But what you're seeing isn't a system generating new wealth. It's a system coasting on the past. Old capital, inherited property, savings built in a richer era, government spending holding demand together, tourism money circling the same postcard districts. France looks rich the way a beautifully maintained house looks valuable. No. Even when the owner can barely afford the heating bill. Because real wealth moves, it expands and it creates options. It gives people room to make mistakes and still recover. In France, that room is shrinking. For millions of people, life hasn't collapsed. It has simply stopped improving. They're not starving, they're not panicking, they're stuck. And when things look fine, warning signs get ignored. Because economies don't fail when life becomes unbearable. They fail when effort stops paying off. At some point, every system teaches people what effort is worth. In France, that lesson has become brutally clear. Imagine you did everything society asked of you. Years of education, competitive exams, a master's degree, a respectable job in a professional field. You didn't take shortcuts. You didn't rebel. You played by the rules. Then your first real paycheck arrives. And something feels wrong. Not because the number's zero, not because you can't survive, but because the difference between you, with years of training and responsibility, and someone working a minimum wage job is barely noticeable. Not enough to change how you live. Not enough to move cities. Not enough to build a future. This isn't a personal failure. It's structural. Over time, France compressed its wage ladder into a narrow band, a process economists call SMICization. The floor keeps rising, the ceiling doesn't. When inflation hits, the government raises the minimum wage fast. Companies can't match it higher up the ladder. Payroll taxes make sure of that. So the bottom moves up, the middle stands still, and the distance between getting by and getting ahead shrinks into a rounding error. This has consequences far beyond income statistics. Because when effort stops producing meaningful reward, behavior changes. Why take on more responsibility if the payoff is symbolic? Why manage people, absorb stress, or innovate when the upside barely exists? Why push harder when standing still feels rational? This is how motivation dies, not through crisis, through arithmetic. In healthy economies, ambition buys options. More income means more choices, more freedom to experiment, more willingness to take risk. In France, ambition often buys the same lifestyle, just with longer hours. People don't feel poor, they feel undervalued. And when millions independently reach that same conclusion, that extra effort isn't worth it. The economy begins to slow without anyone calling a strike. No single law, no single recession headline, just a quiet collective decision to stop pushing. That's the real damage of SMICization. It doesn't create chaos, it creates apathy. And then housing arrives. And the illusion stops being philosophical. You can tolerate stagnant wages for a while. You can accept high taxes. You can tell yourself free healthcare makes it balance out. But rent doesn't care about ideology. In France, housing is where the middle-class story finally breaks. Take Paris. Not luxury penthouses, not historic mansions. Just a normal studio. A small, functional studio meant for one person living an ordinary life. A box where you can touch the fridge from your bed. The cost of that space often equals or exceeds the monthly take-home pay of a median worker, which means something fundamental has changed. The middle class can no longer live where opportunity is. People aren't choosing roommates for fun, they're choosing them to survive. They're not delaying families because of lifestyle preference. They're delaying because the math doesn't work. And once housing consumes most of your income, every other decision becomes defensive. You don't take risks. You don't change careers. You don't start businesses. You don't move for better opportunities because moving itself is unaffordable. Housing quietly locks people in place, not violently, constantly. What makes the French case especially corrosive is the mismatch between income and property. Wages are tightly compressed, but real estate prices reflect global demand, inherited wealth, and decades of scarcity. The result is a split reality. Property owners accumulate security and leverage. Renters tread water permanently. Home ownership, once the backbone of middle-class stability, drifts out of reach for younger professionals. Not because they're irresponsible, but because saving becomes impossible when rent eats the future. So people adapt in subtle ways. They stay in smaller apartments longer than planned. They delay children. They remain in cities that no longer offer upward mobility. They accept stagnation as normal. None of this looks like a crisis. The streets remain clean. The cafés remain full. Life continues. But beneath that normality, housing transforms from shelter into a mechanism of economic suffocation. Not dramatic, not violent, just constant. And when a middle class can't secure stable housing, without sacrificing mobility, ambition, and family formation, an economy doesn't break overnight. It quietly stops renewing itself. Now zoom out. If you leave the polished center of Paris and drive a few hours in almost any direction, you start seeing the other France. Not the one on postcards, not the one in tourism ads. Former factory towns, silent industrial zones, warehouses where assembly lines once ran and never came back. This didn't happen overnight. For decades, policymakers convinced themselves manufacturing was obsolete, dirty, old-fashioned, unnecessary. The future they believed belonged to services, consulting, culture, and tourism. So factories were allowed to disappear. At first, it didn't look like a mistake. Tourism boomed, luxury brands thrived. Paris became a global showroom. France didn't stop looking productive. It stopped producing. Manufacturing shrank and was replaced by sectors that depend on visitors, government spending, or money earned elsewhere. What remained were fragments of past industrial glory. Aerospace, nuclear power, high-speed rail. Impressive, but isolated, not a system, not an engine. This is how France drifted into a museum economy, a country optimized to be admired, not to generate broad-based prosperity. Tourism creates activity. It fills cafes and hotels, but it doesn't anchor communities. It doesn't sustain supply chains. It doesn't provide scalable middle-income jobs across regions. Factories do. When factories leave, something deeper disappears with them. Skilled blue-collar work, local suppliers, career ladders that don't require elite degrees, entire towns built around steady production. Without those jobs, regional economies hollow out. Young people leave, shops close, schools shrink, doctors retire and aren't replaced. What's left isn't ideological anger, it's economic resentment. People aren't furious because they hate globalization. They're furious because globalization passed them by. A museum economy looks beautiful. It attracts visitors. It generates headlines. But it cannot support a modern middle class at scale. And when a country stops building things, it eventually stops building futures. Maintaining a museum economy is expensive. When you stop producing enough value at home, you have two choices: adjust expectations or borrow to preserve the lifestyle. France chose borrowing. For years, it worked quietly. No sudden panic, no emergency austerity, No dramatic headlines, just deficits treated as normal. But here's the detail that changes everything. France doesn't control its own printing press. Unlike countries that issue their own currency, France borrows in money it cannot create. The euro is shared. Monetary policy is external. That means there is no emergency lever to pull when the math turns ugly. As long as interest rates stayed low, this felt manageable. Cheap borrowing masked bad arithmetic. Debt looked abstract, distant, someone else's problem, but debt is patient. And when rates rise, it stops being theoretical. Interest payments begin to compete with everything else: schools, infrastructure, public investment. At that point, debt is no longer a background statistic. It becomes a governing force. France can't just inflate it away. Currency devaluation isn't an option. And growth can't outrun the burden because growth was sacrificed elsewhere. What remains are the least popular options: higher taxes, reduced services, or paralysis until markets decide. Debt doesn't destroy nations overnight. It narrows their freedom of action year by year, until even sensible reforms feel impossible. And once freedom shrinks, a country can still look stable while slowly losing control. So the bill shows up in the cost of work. On paper, salaries don't look terrible. Contracts show respectable numbers. Gross pay appears solid, but gross pay is fiction. What matters is how much it costs to hire someone, and how much of that cost reaches their pocket. In France, the gap between those two numbers is enormous. By the time an employer finishes paying payroll taxes and mandatory charges of hiring becomes expensive before work even begins. By the time employees pay deductions and income tax, take-home pay feels strangely thin. Nearly half the money spent on labor disappears before it becomes spending power. This creates a vicious loop. Companies hesitate to hire because each employee becomes a long-term obligation inflated by the state. Raises become rare, not out of greed, but out of arithmetic. Workers feel permanently squeezed. They see the effort, they see the hours, they just don't see the reward. When disposable income shrinks, consumption weakens. When consumption weakens, local businesses stall. When growth stalls, the state collects less revenue and raises taxes again. It's not malicious, it's mechanical. A slow economic constriction where everyone feels poor, without any single moment of collapse. Then comes the intergenerational pressure. Every society eventually has to answer one uncomfortable question: who is paying for the past? In France, the answer is increasingly simple: the young. France's pension system is pay-as-you-go. Today's workers fund today's retirees. That works when demographics cooperate. They don't anymore. The population is aging. People live longer. Birth rates fall. The pool of workers carrying the system shrinks. Young workers pay more for benefits they increasingly doubt they'll receive. And here's the political reality: retirees vote. Young people leave. That imbalance locks the system in place. Cutting pensions is untouchable. Reform gets delayed. Reality gets delayed. The bill gets delayed, until someone proposes raising the retirement age, even slightly. Then the streets fill. To outsiders, the reaction looks irrational, but the anger hides the truth. The system isn't defended because it works. It's defended because admitting it doesn't is worse. For younger workers, the message becomes implicit. You will pay more, receive less, and be told to accept it. That doesn't create solidarity. It creates exits. France is exceptionally good at producing talent, but not at keeping it. Walk into tech offices in London, research labs in Switzerland, startups in California. French names everywhere: engineers, researchers, founders. France's elite education is world-class. It trains people who can compete anywhere. And once they realize that, many of them do. The decision isn't emotional, it's mathematical. Stay and you accept narrow wage bands, high taxes, rigid hierarchies, slow progression. Leave and the same skills unlock higher pay, faster advancement, more upside. This isn't about greed, it's about optionality. When ambition meets a cap system, ambition moves. Talent doesn't revolt, it relocates. The cost isn't immediate. The streets don't empty overnight. But underneath, future growth capacity leaks out. Innovators leave before they become employers. Researchers leave before they build teams. Entrepreneurs leave before they scale at home. Meanwhile, the social contract begins to crack. For decades, the deal sounded simple. Pay high taxes, receive world-class public services, but the contract is quietly breaking. Emergency rooms stretch. Medical deserts expand in rural areas. Schools struggle to recruit. Institutions lose credibility. And the most corrosive part is that the price never went down. Taxes stayed high. Contributions stayed mandatory. Only the delivery changed, so people adapt. Those with means opt out. Private schools, private clinics, private security. Everyone else navigates stretched services and shrinking capacity. A two-tier society emerges. Equality stops being a lived experience and becomes a slogan carved into buildings. When trust disappears, compliance turns into resentment. Taxes feel punitive instead of collective. Rules feel extractive instead of protective. Citizens don't revolt overnight. They disengage, and then the psychological weight settles in. Every economy runs on expectations. In France, expectations have quietly collapsed. Not because life is unbearable, but because the gap between story and reality became impossible to ignore. A country raised on greatness begins to feel smaller than its past. People stop believing effort will be rewarded. They stop taking risks. They protect what they have. Consumers spend less because they're unsure. Entrepreneurs hesitate because failure feels permanent. Pessimism becomes self-fulfilling. You can change tax rates in a year. You can pass reforms with enough votes. But restoring belief takes a generation. Now here's the part outsiders miss. France isn't an exception. It's an early signal. In old coal mines, workers carried canaries underground. Not because the birds were weak, but because they reacted first. France is reacting first. An aging population shifting the burden onto fewer workers. An economy moving away from making things. Debt used to preserve stability. A boxed-in middle class that feels safe, but stuck. None of this is uniquely French. France just reached the limits earlier. Other Western countries are following, only with a delay. Some control their currency. Some grow faster. Some have more immigration. That buys time. It doesn't eliminate the math. The warning isn't collapse. It's stagnation with structure. Life continues. Institutions remain. The lights stay on. But momentum fades. And when momentum disappears, societies don't fall apart. They become brittle. France isn't finished. It hasn't collapsed. It isn't about to disappear. But it is living on borrowed time and borrowed money. What keeps it afloat isn't momentum. It's inertia. A heavy system that keeps moving forward, even as its engine weakens. But inertia eventually runs out. Debt doesn't forgive itself. Demographics don't reverse on command. And confidence, once questioned, doesn't return easily. That's not decline by collapse. It's decline by delay. The illusion of wealth remains convincing, as long as no one asks who is paying for it and for how long. And if this feels uncomfortably familiar, it should, because France isn't unique. It's early.